Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Chapter 21. Being Seen. After they'd been attacked, Kliyd had been patrolling the vicinity alone, prepared to kill again while her siblings recovered.
"Where are you going?"
A soft voice had come from over Klyd's head. The voice should have frightened her, but the Tikas had just aerated a man's throat, and nothing else could seem intimidating.
"I think the bastard came from in here."
The voice continued. It sounded strangely familiar to Kliyd, who had leapt up to the destroyed building's floor with hardly a sound. An orc had been hunched over a trapdoor. She was perhaps only a few years older than Kliyd, but much taller. It had been difficult for the Tikas to see what the orc had been doing, so she'd drawn closer, stepping over some weathered beams and other debris. In the dim moonlight, she'd seen the orc wearing loose-fitting clothes under leather armor. When the woman had looked up, Kliyd had seen her beads and pendants hanging from leather cords around her neck, and had thought she recognized those square-framed glasses.
A lot of good this was doing him.
The orc had gestured to a padlock and chain lying loosely off the trapdoor, securing nothing. Kliyd, standing, had been roughly the same height as this formidable person crouched on the floor. She'd sat down on some debris and continued to observe, realizing this situation was another hallucination.
"You don't say much, do you, Kliyd?"
The woman had repeatedly tucked her hair behind her ears.
"When I was younger, I never bothered talking much either. People took one look at me and already knew what they wanted to know. There wasn't much point in proving them wrong."
Not counting Gorm's uncanny image spells, Kliyd had only ever seen an orc in person once before, the man who'd picked a fight with her siblings and a dog at Raven's Cross. This orc's face had been unfamiliar, until Kliyd had seen her glasses and heard her voice, which was the same mellow and slightly sarcastic voice of the gnome she'd met in her bedroom back home. Her hallucinations had suggested this orc woman and that gnome girl were the same person.
"I feel much more confident when I speak as someone else. It makes me very good at what I do. But this is the real me, and while I can deceive people when necessary, I'll never deceive myself."
She'd drawn a long breath, then flashed Kliyd a sly, toothy grin.
"You know what I do enjoy? If people write me off as ugly or intimidating, I become invisible to them, undesirable. They never think to check on me, checking on them. Meanwhile, I can hear everything they're saying and see everything they're doing. People are so simple. They'll tell each other secrets within earshot of me like I'm a potted plant. I can watch a man undressing a woman with his eyes. She might be unaware of his gaze, but he is unaware of me. People can be pretty stupid, but men are the most blatant about it."
Kliyd was too tired but also too surprised by this person's transformation to notice the cynicism in her words. It was a kind of cynicism that comes from a place of hurt and perseverance. She wondered if the woman was alluding to some sort of physical change with her mention of speaking as somebody else. She decided that fatigue seemed to be the secret ingredient for a hallucination. The orc had stood up, and Kliyd had realized she was taller than both her brothers. She'd brushed herself off and sighed.
"Keep taking care of yourself. It's far more important than being seen anyway."
You still have the same voice.
Kliyd hadn't been sure if this person wanted a response or for someone to simply listen and notice her.
Do you really sleep outside?
The woman instantly smiled.
"I'm glad you remembered me. The Tikas always know, don't they? And yes, most orcs prefer to sleep outside like wolves because we don't have much to fear. Well, that's what we like to say about it. And they call me Wolf too. Well, Copper Wolf if we're being formal."
Kliyd had thought she'd seen movement reflecting the woman's glasses. She turned to see a figure approaching in the woods and had discovered Vicariu was out looking for her. The Tikas had wondered how long she'd been separated from her siblings. Before she'd hopped off the platform, she turned again to confirm no one was there after all. Chapter 22. Enterprising. Rukari opened his eyes in darkness. The only hints of morning came from sunlight peeking through cracks in the floorboards above. Sitting up, he pawed at the low ceiling and found the trap door, but decided against opening it just yet. He'd let his siblings sleep as long as they needed. Elves didn't require a full night to meditate. Over the years, he'd learned to extend this time and to do so with his eyes closed. But his favorite diversion while waiting for his siblings to wake up was to read. Of course, he couldn't see, let alone read, in darkness. To remedy this, Rukari would quietly cast light on a small length of yarn or string, and tuck it like a bookmark between pages as he read. Unfortunately, his paperbacks remained in their old dormitory, or maybe they didn't, and the dormitory had been destroyed. Maybe that entire world had been destroyed. While reaching for his rucksack, the elf had mistakenly grabbed a foot.
Huh?
Thankfully, Niwa hadn't responded with terror. She'd been through a lot of trauma, as had they all. Waking up to someone grabbing her foot could have rendered a very different reaction.
Oh!
Rukari exclaimed. Then, he remembered to whisper.
Sorry, Niwa. I didn't realize that was your foot.
We should get going,
Said Kliyd, in darkness. She made some shuffling noises as she gathered herself. Rukari felt guilty he'd woken his family up. He stood and opened the trap door. The hinges squeaked loudly as light poured into the shallow basement. Kliyd scampered out first, practically leaping through the trap door. Rukari felt some irritation but knew Kliyd might have felt claustrophobic and uncomfortable in this makeshift shelter all night. As her siblings gathered their belongings, she began guard duty, making herself indispensable and vigilant as always.
Are you all right, Niwa?
Aiden appraised his sister's condition as he gathered his lumpy rucksack, which had served as his improvised pillow. He was preparing to help her if her shoulder was still badly injured, despite his healing. Morning sunlight shone on Niwa's face.
I'm gonna be fine. I promise not to be dead weight any longer. I fell asleep last night thinking up a plan for our success.
She hopped out onto the roadhouse floor. Beside her bag, she held the dinner plate under her arm.
You're not dead weight.
Aiden refuted. He looked to Rukari for an unspoken explanation before climbing outside. Rukari did recall their sister saying something despondent last night, but only shrugged at his brother.
Not anymore.
Niwa said.
I didn't succeed all my people to fail now. They have my back, and I am with them too.
She placed the plate on the floor, then found an angle at which the morning sun reflected brilliantly off the plate's glazed finish. She squinted at the pure light bouncing back into the sky, then started mumbling.
Guan Skoi befriended the Liu clan, who once traveled south of Raven's Cross. No, wait a second.
Niwa seemed to be reciting lore as part of her summoning ability, but might have been making it up as she went along. She called to her siblings.
We're not home anymore. Is this still Raven's Cross? Shoot.
Kliyd went to stand next to Niwa. She'd watched the young gnome share stories with ancestors, and mostly understood how her sister invoked the spirits. The Tikis looked out to the corpse of the crazed man who'd attacked them yesterday, gathering her thoughts but showing no emotion.
This place was owned by a gnome. Later, someone else ran the business when it was destroyed. That someone was a bad manager. Maybe the gnome died.
Kliyd, focusing on the body in the distance, didn't look to her sister as she spoke.
Kliyd, what are you telling me?
The Tikis faced her sister, her eyes showing unusual warmth and compassion.
The gnome left some clues. Please tell this in your story.
Niwa closed her eyes, then squinted into the sunlight once again.
A gnome lived here ages ago, and his roadhouse brought travelers from far and wide. He knew stories from across the continent.
She tried a handful of statements. Each one was a guess, and each one affected no result. She was getting frustrated. The night before, she'd felt helpless and inadequate. But this morning, she'd resolved to contribute to her family's success. She didn't doubt her sister's conjecture, but she now doubted herself and felt uncomfortable fibbing during her invocation to this gnome. Rukari finally emerged from the basement with Saba's bag fastened haphazardly to his own. Aiden greeted him.
What do you have there, Rook?
The elf was holding a copper pipe, perhaps a plumbing fixture. It had a right-angled elbow at one end with an unusual hexagonal fitting. The long end tapered into two flattened prongs. This pipe had more layers of copper soldered onto it than conventional plumbing. The result was lovely and durable. Its texture resembled papier-mâché.
I found this when I was packing up.
Rukari said.
It's got a solid heft to it. I think it was used to open various crates and casks. What can I say? It piqued my interest.
Aiden nodded.
I think Niwa is trying to summon again. I'm looking forward to seeing this in action, but she seems to be having trouble. Speaking of trouble, I should go check on our buddy in the dirt over there, just to be sure.
He hopped off the foundation and walked toward the body. Approaching his sister, Rakaru said,
You know your stuff. Think about the wine cellar. You were scared, but you held to your convictions. This time, we're all prepared for the journey ahead, and we're all here for you, Niwa.
That's right.
hollered Aiden.
I'm just making sure we're the only ones here for you this time.
He prodded the corpse with his boot. He then squatted to inspect it further and poked at it with his short sword.
That belonged to the gnome who owned the roadhouse.
Kliyd looked at the pipe her brother held.
What did?
Niwa felt uncomfortable watching her brother mess with the dead body. When she heard something about gnomes, her eyes landed on the pipe, and her face lit up instantly.
Please.
Her brother offered her the pipe, which she accepted.
This detail is wild.
Niwa said excitedly.
Only a gnome would add this much artistic detail to even the simplest tools.
She examined it from all angles, then asked her sister,
You knew this belonged to a gnome, didn't you?
Yes, you've told me about the gnomes.
Kliyd was hinting at the conversation they'd shared on the roof of their old home.
Isn't that the truth?
Niwa chuckled.
Rook, did you know that as well? Where did you find this?
Actually, no. I didn't realize it was of gnomish design. But now that you mention it, I suppose that makes sense given how ostentatious it is. I found it as I was packing up. I just thought after yesterday's travels you might like a proper walking stick.
The tool had functioned once more. Niwa grasped the pipe's elbow and tapped its end against the roadhouse floor. For gnomes, given their small stature relative to humans and elves, this was sized just right for her. She threw out her arms to hug her siblings. Rakaru put an arm around her shoulder, while Kliyd awkwardly let the embrace just happen to her. Niwa leaned forward intensely, as though in a huddle.
An enterprising gnome brought signs of life and prosperity to this pocket of the world no longer traveled by the masses. This roadhouse fortified many a lost soul.
Niwa paused.
Like me. The gnomes always know the way.
Light rippled off the plate's surface in a blinding flash. Averting her eyes, Niwa saw another gnome standing by the former front entrance of the roadhouse. The rugged man was tall for his kind. His hearty voice was convivial and perfectly suited for an older bar owner. A collection of wild tattoos matched his dark eyes and hair and goatee.
You're speaking of my wife, lass,
said the gnome.
She was the brave one, the spark who brought our place to life.
This was the second gnome in 2 days who'd called her lass, which evoked an odd feeling of nostalgia she couldn't place.
I'm very happy to meet you. My name is Leo Niwa, and I'm descended from a clan of travelers who perhaps visited this place once. Could you tell me your name?
Niwa had come to know herself as a genuine descendant, finally saying it aloud.
I could.
The man chuckled to himself.
I'm Jung Idsu, but dare I suppose I know anyone from the Liu clan? For sure, if we could only be sure. The world is a mighty big place.
It sure is.
Niwa said.
I'm glad you're here. See, my family and I are lost. We're trying to find a little town called Raven's Cross. Are we even close? Could you...
She caught herself and rephrased the question.
Where is Raven's Cross from here, please?
Aiden had returned to the platform. Now all her siblings stood behind her and watched with great interest.
Looks like the Liu clan knows just how big the world is with a family looking like you lot. Hold still and I could frame you like a portrait.
The man guffawed.
I tease. Where does a raven cross, did you say? Never heard of such a thing.
He walked as if to leave.
Please wait.
Rakaru feared losing their chance to ask more questions. He tried to think quickly.
Sir, could you tell us where the nearest town or village is from here?
The gnome hopped off the platform and walked towards the debris where the roadhouse's front steps had stood.
It's good to be back, my dear.
He touched a part of the foundation, then returned his attention to the diverse group.
Where do we go when the going has gone?
He had tears in his eyes and cleared his throat.
The nearest town is beyond this hill here. Follow the ridge to the northeast. Silk Rhode is built into the mountain's base, but it's no place for young ones. Most of my patrons traveled there, rough lot that they were. Probably brought this place to the ground in the end, they did.
That sounds like the right place.
Niwa said.
Would you like to go with us? I have so many questions I'd like to ask you, but don't know where to begin.
She realized her summon spell would likely cease in a few minutes, but figured the offer would buy her time. The gnome hoisted himself back up. When Aiden realized this older man was climbing onto the foundation, he jogged forward to lend a hand, but the man had already successfully ascended by himself. He met Aiden's eyes with a look of pure indifference. The human, not wanting to appear rebuffed, offered a wan smile. He couldn't believe how real this summoned being was.
At the moment, I'd most like some of my famous Cloudberry Pale Ale.
He glanced briefly at the trapdoor.
But I imagine there's nothing left. Not to suggest that you young ones cleaned it out, of course.
He chuckled once more, but it felt less genuine.
I don't think anyone has been here in a long time.
Niwa bluffed, not wanting to waste time drawing her host's attention to the slain man. Her siblings realized this and understood.
Oh, you found my Doha.
The man looked at the copper implement in Niwa's hands.
My wife's mother made that for us when we opened the place. She was pretty slick with magic and thought even simple tools could stand to look a bit prettier. Some said it's too pretty to use, but I'll level with you. I used it all the time.
His eyes flickered with that gnomish glint of mischief the siblings had seen before in their sister.
Your Doha?
Ricari was looking forward to a moment of education.
I get it.
Niwa laughed.
Copper tooth. Did you come up with that?
Nah, lass. The Mrs. Mother had gnome terms for everything. With magic heat, she'd add the metal, then use magic again to strengthen and shine. My wife knew a bit too. We worked a wicked kitchen.
Though she was smiling, Niwa was considering each passing moment. The man's stories were wonderful, but surely there was some question she needed to ask. Then it dawned on her.
Oh, I wanted to ask something unusual. Who would you say was the bravest, most capable fighter ever to set foot in your place?
Aiden and Ricari both looked at their sister in surprise, then back to the man with interest. Kliyd remained nonplussed, as usual, but was certainly listening.
Not a regular, mind you, but I will always remember the day a pair of winter wraiths were driven away from here by Mandragora Rose, and single-handedly, mind you. When spirits get restless, they get ruinous. I was grateful for the reinforcements.
The man was tapping his foot.
Winter wraiths?
Aiden repeated quietly. He'd never heard of such creatures before, but, then again, this wasn't his world. They sounded supernatural and malevolent. Something about the story and this champion seemed exaggerated. Then again, Aiden wouldn't have minded if people were to exaggerate stories about him one day.
I'll come back and visit you again, Izu, I promise.
Niwa said preemptively, fearing her spell would end soon. Inwardly, she was repeating Mandragora Rose over and over again, committing the name to memory.
That'd be lovely, lass. Can you call my wife next time? I'm missing her terribly.
The man seemed to take non-sequiturs in a stride. He'd spent years in life listening to people simultaneously while being at their service. Feeling bold, Niwa cast her arms open wide, and Izu accepted the hug. The squeeze felt real. The young gnome had never experienced the touch of one of her people before. She thanked him and held out the doa. The man had no sooner smiled and placed a hand on his old heirloom tool when he blinked out of sight. A breeze swept over the old roadhouse's remains, and the four were once again alone.
Shall we go to this Silk Rhode town?
Aiden wanted to get moving now that he knew where they were going.
Certainly,
Ricari said.
Niwa, I'm truly amazed at this ability of yours. It's genuine arcana at work, but it's clear you found a method unlike any other arcana I've ever seen. It's remarkable.
Niwa was so thankful for her siblings. Many times during Gorham's lessons, she'd felt uncoordinated or even incompetent while Ricari demonstrated his spellcraft nearly perfectly. She'd known she wasn't a failure, and some spells had come fairly easily to her, but now her older brother knew just how to encourage her and keep her committed to the practice. She didn't know how to articulate this to him, but flashed a smile his way.
I'm glad we're back on track too. Thanks, Niwa. If we get going now, I bet we can get there by mid-afternoon.
Aiden meant what he'd said, but hadn't been subtle in expressing his main priority. It occurred to him his siblings might not be in lockstep with him marching into the unknown.
Oh!
Niwa made a clicking sound with her tongue.
I meant to ask Izu for his wife's name.
How about this?
Kliyd had hopped off the platform to examine where the man had been looking. One brick in the foundation was engraved, though she couldn't read it. Niwa and Ricari climbed down to see their sister's discovery, as Aiden grew impatient.
Anhas.
Niwa said, reading the gnomish text.
It's a flower. Gnomes mention it in folk songs and stories. I imagine it was the name of this roadhouse.
It's both,
said Kliyd.
Niwa, when did you learn to read gnomish script?
Asked Ricari.
Pretty please.
Aiden said in a silly voice he intended to sound lighthearted. He wanted to find a room to rent in a real town, not stay here any longer. He also hoped someone in a nearby town might know where Gorm and Saba were. Niwa felt slightly overwhelmed by her siblings' input.
That's a good question. I feel like I've always known the writing. Maybe I was writing at a very young age.
She realized her response must have sounded mysterious, and this delighted her. Maybe Rocario hadn't simply been flattering her with his kind words.
Kliyd, what do you mean?
Niwa then thought to ask.
The wife and the building share the name.
Kliyd appeared sure of her answer. Niwa beamed, then looked at Aiden.
You're right. Let's get going.
As they walked toward the hill, Rocario reached into Saba's bag and distributed more snacks.
I do hope this other Raven's Cross has a proper restaurant.
Rook, we don't have any money.
Niwa reminded him. This obvious fact flabbergasted the elf. Whenever the family had enjoyed lunch at Raven's Cross, Gorm had paid. Rocario had never stopped to consider it. Since arriving in this new world, this moment made him feel the most naive, and it unnerved him.
We can come up with something,
Aiden said.
Thanks for the food, Rook. I'm starving. Speaking of, I looked over the maniac who attacked us last night. He looked like he'd been starving, even though he'd had that big belly and barfed everywhere.
He failed to consider not discussing this while they were eating.
That's right, his stomach was grotesquely distended.
Rocario agreed.
That was alcohol. You could smell it.
Aiden inflected his words to sound gross.
Aiden.
Niwa complained, then briefly closed her eyes.
Sorry. I brought it up because his behavior doesn't make sense to me. How he looked terrible and moved so ferociously. He didn't go down after attacks that would kill anyone else. It was like he was possessed. Something doesn't add up.
We had to destroy him to kill him.
Kliyd had also been thinking about that awful encounter for much of the morning.
It's a lot to think about,
Niwa said.
but I'd rather not think about it right now. It was an awful experience.
Fair enough.
Aiden ran his fingers along the earthen slope.
There seems to be a lot of this world we don't understand yet. Like, why this new Raven's Cross is no place for children.
After an hour of walking, the siblings crested a ridge and saw buildings just over the next hill. Even from a distance, the town lacked the colorful quality of the Raven's Cross they all knew a world ago. Chapter 23. Hazelnuts. A distressed stockade along the ridge suggested defense or prohibited entry. But as the siblings ascended the slope, they saw an unguarded opening in the stone wall.
Welcome to Silk Rhode.
Aiden frowned and dropped his shoulders.
Something smells.
Kliyd said literally. As they continued to walk, the smell of stale smoke lingered in the still air.
I really don't want to stay here tonight. Promise me we'll leave shortly. We can come back tomorrow or something.
Niwa muttered before they entered the opening. It was already afternoon, and the sun would be setting in a couple hours. This place was definitely not Raven's Cross. The trail up the hill did feel familiar, but a porous hillside replaced the resplendent homes with colored glass rooftops. The brilliant sunlight cast over mostly dirt. People milled around the town as the siblings remembered, but there were fewer buildings, and they looked like stone bunkers jutting out from the hill. There were also illuminated caves and recesses that were possibly homes or businesses. The siblings walked slowly. Everything was new and unexpected. The air felt somehow stale. A human child about the same age as Ulysse sat in the middle of the main avenue. He was filthy, and he was making a cairn out of chunks of brick. A toddler beside him watched and cooed and occasionally screamed. People walked around the young, unattended boys.
No place for children.
Rocario repeated the gnome's words. A human scurried up to Aiden.
Have you some dragon's breath?
He hollered in the young man's face, showing no couth and almost no teeth.
What?
Aiden stared at the man in blatant surprise as his siblings gathered about him. They weren't used to being accosted. Gorm had taught them to be quiet and polite, and to mind their business.
Dragon's breath
The man wheezed.
keeps the fire in the belly burning real smooth.
No, sir.
Aiden replied firmly, hoping the man would go away. He struggled not to show pity. As the siblings resumed walking, the man tried to make eye contact with Niwa, Rocario, and Kliyd. Realizing he wasn't getting anywhere, he wandered off to accost the next stranger. Kliyd watched him to ensure he wouldn't come back. She'd realized he smelled like a concentrated version of that smoky odor she'd smelled when they first entered town.
Can we look for a place to eat?
Niwa quietly asked, feeling self-conscious.
I'm not sure about this place, but we should try to stock up.
How do we pay for it?
Rukaryu asked, also in hushed tones. Ever since he'd been made aware of his funding oversight, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about it.
Oh.
Niwa responded with dismay.
How do we even know what they use for money here?
Rukaryu hissed, trying to keep his voice down. A human woman and an orc woman walked past him just then, making him feel embarrassed.
There are gemstones in with the hazelnuts,
Kliyd said. The siblings all looked at their Tika's sister. Rukaryu thought this sounded like a coded message out of his mystery novels. His sister's words seemed tantamount to "the owl flies at midnight."
Rook, the bag.
Aiden said, nudging him. Rukaryu pushed Gorm's rolled-up paperwork out of the way and started rummaging. There wasn't much food left, so he found the small pouch of hazelnuts easily. Underneath that pouch, however, was something he hadn't noticed until now. Aiden took the pouch, since Rukaryu was absently holding it up. Quickly looking around as though he were about to do something devious, he untied and opened it.
Eat a hazelnut.
Kliyd said loudly while looking away.
Do it now.
Confused, Aiden did as she commanded. His hand grazed hard-edged pieces within the pouch, but he fished out a hazelnut easily. He knew his sister had been right about the gemstones. Kliyd was usually right when she spoke up about something.
Want one?
Aiden offered the pouch to Kliyd as he munched away. He'd realized his sister had warned him about onlookers, so he was trying to play along. He was a little surprised when she reached out her hand. He gladly handed her a hazelnut.
Thank you.
Kliyd followed something or someone, but Aiden couldn't discern who or what. Then she relaxed, scratched behind her ear, and ate the offering.
That was cool.
Niwa marveled at her sister's guile.
Do we have enough hazelnuts to buy a few hot meals?
Saba left us a handbook.
Rukaryu was leafing through a portfolio.
Was that in the bag?
Aiden asked, collecting the bag his brother had absently dropped on the dusty ground.
Yes. This is everything.
Rukaryu struggled to find words.
We need to find a room or something. I need to read this as soon as possible. I don't understand what I'm reading here, but it feels like answers to questions I didn't know I had.
I want to read it too.
Niwa was still excited about being a secret agent in a new place. She leaned into the suspense.
Do you think a room here is safe? We should check this place out first. It could be dangerous.
Of course it could be.
Aiden said.
Raven's Cross ended up being dangerous, and that place had always felt hospitable.
We can get a room.
Kliyd said.
It's easy to leave here, and we have the roadhouse not too far away.
Do you suppose after dark they guard that opening in the stockade?
Rukaryu asked, clutching the portfolio to his side.
It looks like they deforested half the hill making that thing. It's such a shame.
I doubt it.
Niwa said.
Something tells me this place ran out of skilled security when they ran out of trees. There's no one around to guard children sitting in the road.
We'll be safe. I'll make sure of it.
Aiden wanted to sound valorous, like something a hero would say. He also didn't want to spend another night in the musty dirt under an old crawl space. Chapter 24. Portfolio. A simple inn was built into the granite slope of Silk Rhode's border. With few options, the siblings entered the opened door, following the faint smell of lentils. Aiden was eager for any cooked meal and any smell other than stale smoke. This dirty town was the busiest place the siblings had ever seen. The innkeeper was an old gnome woman who hadn't hesitated to accept some of the small gemstones as payment. She'd appeared indifferent to 4 diverse young people renting one small room. And she'd shrugged when Niwa began badgering her with questions from someone who'd claimed to be a long-lost relative. Kliyd had approved this room because of a round window near the ceiling that was large enough to be a serviceable egress if trouble found them during the night. She stood on the bed trying to observe people walking outside, mostly talking or coughing. Their closeness made her feel uncomfortable.
I already miss bread.
Aiden returned to their room carrying water and a large bowl of red lentil soup.
There's a table out there with food, but no place to eat it. I just brought it back here.
A hot meal sounds terrific.
Rukaryu said while spreading out Saba's journal and Gorm's papers on the bed.
What about spoons?
From his vest, Aiden produced one dingy spoon.
We'll have to share. This is all I could find.
Niwa returned to the room holding yellow potatoes.
I think these were boiled and left out. They're barely warm, but at least they're salted.
Kliyd hopped down carefully behind Rikaru. Aiden grinned, handing her the spoon.
Thanks.
She said, surprised to be the first to eat.
Rook, I want to learn a new spell. Did you find that spell Gorham used so we can go home?
Niwa offered Rikaru a potato.
I'll find it.
Rikaru hadn't thought to look for that spell. He smiled, shaking his head and hoping Niwa wouldn't reach for papers with sticky hands. Having eaten, Kliyd leafed through her mother's journal. She felt a strange bulge, then found a folded page slipped beneath the inside covering. Opening it, she noticed her name and discreetly pocketed the page.
We can't go home,
Aiden said.
The house is destroyed. Besides, Professor Gorham and Miss Saba came with us. We need to be looking for them instead of going home.
Is this something we all know to be true?
Rikaru asked.
They asked us to pack bags, but I didn't see them pack anything. In fact, you were given extra supplies, Aiden.
He noticed Kliyd was now staring at him. She looked distraught.
It was really dark in that basement. I'm sure they had bags packed as well. There's no way our parents left us alone in some strange new world.
Niwa munched on a potato.
We were trained for this.
Kliyd mumbled, looking at Saba's journal as she passed the soup to Rikaru.
Trained for what?
Aiden asked.
We were trained to live on another world? That reminds me. Do we know why our house exists here? When Professor Gorham talked about other worlds, I always thought he meant different places covered in deserts or ice or huge cities. This place definitely isn't home, but it's not that different.
Kliyd, do you feel all right?
Rikaru studied his sister.
I'll be back. Nature calling.
Kliyd said.
Do you want me to go with you? This place is creepy. Might be better off outside. Was it the soup?
Niwa kept talking after Kliyd left.
She shouldn't go out there alone.
Aiden started for the door.
Kliyd will be fine. I think she's having some difficulty processing all these sudden changes. It happened in Aubrey's house as well. I understand how she feels.
Rikaru looked down at Saba's journal. Had they been trained in Arcana and self-defense to continue on alone?
We need a plan.
Niwa said.
Tomorrow morning, are we looking for our parents or looking for a way home?
We were sent here for a reason.
Aiden said.
There are more people here, so maybe someone knows where they are. We can try to find another dwarf to ask. One who's not so edgy around company.
That's a good point, Aiden.
Rikaru said.
They have to be here. There's another house for them here, but Aubrey has since moved into it. Let's keep looking for them tomorrow.
I agree.
Niwa grinned, relieved. She picked up one of Gorham's documents, skimming the hand-drawn diagrams of arcane gestures.
This one is called Web. How curious for webs to be Arcana. He never taught us this one. Because I think I'd remember making pretty webs to watch them collect the dew. I'm going to practice this.
The potato gunk on your hand is perfect for making the web sticky.
Rikaru said.
Please don't get us kicked out.
Aiden grinned, thankful his siblings didn't resist his plans this time. Niwa reached for her doha, smiling.
I'm a natural.
She moved stray hair away from her eyes. Chapter 25. Reshaping Destiny. Kliyd returned to the front counter of the inn, listening for others talking behind closed doors. It was getting late, but she was surprised to find herself alone. She leapt over the counter and curled up behind it, eager to have some privacy. The innkeeper's door was closed, as was the inn she imagined. She unfolded the paper from Saba's journal. Kliyd expected she might cry if she started reading, and the paper's faint smell of home activated her emotions first. Her mother's letter began.
Wishing often comes from a place of despair. I wish that one day no child will ever feel unloved. I despair that many still do, though I worry how much I could reshape another's destiny.
Saba had recounted a reverie, listening to a halfling woman with urgent news. She'd described the woman as feeble and confused, talking about a Tikish child who'd been beaten unconscious and left for dead. Kliyd remembered her mother explaining reveries, which she assumed were similar to her hallucinations. Before reading on, Kliyd knew this letter was about her. She hugged her knees as a chill ran down her spine. She knew little about her arrival to the family, and was too shy and self-conscious to ask more questions. Saba wrote she'd told Gorm about the emergency, thankful they'd always been understanding of each other's wishes. She'd packed a rucksack and hugged the children, despairing to leave her family. Traveling with Skunk, she'd channeled her thoughts. Saba had considered her destiny to be tied to that child, which justified her drastic moves for intervention. In the letter, she'd admitted to often choosing not to reveal details about how she experienced empathy, but she'd learned some information before the rendezvous.
The child embraced the name Kliyd, though I didn't think that was her given name. I had never seen a Tikus so small and frail. Her clan often abused or neglected her. She didn't understand and was too scared to speak. I also understood she didn't have the language to express the real Kliyd. She knew her clan saw her as a weak boy. They wanted tough boys. That morning, she finally told them she was a girl.
In a few simple lines, her mother had explained so much. Her words were perfect truth. Kliyd had always known she was a girl. Gorm and Saba had raised her with the freedom to express herself without pressure. They'd understood her pain and her thoughts before ever meeting her. She felt grateful. A few tears fell onto the paper. Saba continued,
When she arrived, the halfling woman was gone. Through the night, she cradled the child in her arms as Skunk carried them home. The next morning, Kliyd had opened her bright eyes, quickly befriending her siblings, who'd been happy to meet their new sister.
Kliyd folded the letter, breathing deeply. She noticed the silence of the lobby, making her feel far away from Saba again. The letter prompted questions she couldn't answer. Why couldn't she remember life with her Tikus clan? Were those memories so traumatic she repressed them all? Where did Saba find her unconscious body? What happened to the halfling woman who'd found her first? The letter provided some insight into how Gorm and Saba might have adopted their children, considering they lived far from almost everyone. Kliyd imagined her mother with the family mule, traveling alone all night to rescue a child she'd found in her dreams. Saba was a wonderful mother who knew her children so well. Her letter was hidden inside the cover of a portfolio hidden inside a rucksack. Perhaps Gorm hadn't seen Saba pass this secret to her children just before leaving their home behind. But she knew her youngest would find the letter about her past. Saba knew Kliyd by heart. On the next episode, once the siblings at last find a place for a good night's rest, Rocario gets closer to the mysterious stranger from his meditation. The voice is clear, and it's coming from the deep unknown.
I want to go beneath the water.
We've never been closer. You'll find me where the land ends. That's where the ocean begins.
In the morning, it's time to continue searching for their missing parents.
We should start looking for Professor Gorm and Miss Saba soon. But I'm only mentioning dwarves when asking around. I don't want people here learning our names or theirs.
But what happens if they talk to the wrong people?
They're listening outside right now.
Chapter 26, Body of Water. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 5 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Kliyd and Copperwolf, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Bill Robinson as Aiden, Jason Pagano as Rocario, Julie Dalpy as Saba, and James Stacy as Idzu and Villager. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed, and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.